Hello, I'm Michael. I'm speaking to you from Bristol, where I am a hub leader. I've been asked to share a book with you from my inner anthology, a book that stays with me, that I revisit and think about, and know that I will continue to return to. And I've chosen The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, written a few years ago, but that I read for the first time this year and have already returned to quite extensively different ways this year already. Sometimes I'm drawn to a story or poem because I can immediately connect with a character or a place. But there's also those stories that grab my attention and stay with me and keep coming back to in my mind, where I seem to share nothing in common with who or what I'm reading about. And these are stories that, for me, they help me understand the experiences I could never otherwise get close to. They might be distant in time or place, or just situations I've never or I'm extremely unlikely to ever go through. And the Underground Railroad is one of those. It begins in Georgia on a plantation in a time of slavery in America. A terrible, terrible place full of misery, violence, and a place where anyone would want to escape from. Some do. Cora does. And the story mainly follows Cora, but there's also Caesar, her friend who she escapes with, and we hear about Mabel, Cora's mother, who apparently abandons her when she escaped the plantation a few years before, and a slave catcher who mercilessly pursues Cora for much of the story. Everything changes in the story when Cora embarks on her escape from the plantation. And it's now that we discover that the Underground Railroad is an actual real thing. Now, it did exist in 19th century America as a network of abolitionists who helped ferry slaves out of the South to free states and to the North. But in this book, it takes actual physical form. It becomes a steam railway in tunnels, underground, speeding through those tunnels and stopping at towns and cities along the way. So as Cora moves from town to town, slowly making her way north, when she surfaces, she sees for herself the realities of life, and in particular, life for Black people in these different towns. Most of the time, of course, she has to be hidden while she's in these places. But in one town in South Carolina, Black people's lives are still highly controlled and manipulated, but she is able to get somewhere to live and to work for a wage. And there's one section which has really stayed with me from this bit of the book, which I've read several times. Cora has been told to start a new job in the local museum, and she thinks she will be working there as a cleaner, but in fact, she's going to be one of three living exhibits, acting in various scenes from American history. And in several of these scenes, Black people are represented, and it's in these cases they're portrayed by Cora and her two colleagues who work with her. One exhibit, for example, is labelled Scenes from Darkest Africa, and this is how it's described. There was a cooking fire, the flames represented by shards of red glass, a small, roughly made bench, and assorted tools, gourds, and shells. 3 large black birds hung from the ceiling on a wire. The intended effect was that of a flock circling over the activity of the natives. They reminded Cora of the buzzards that chewed the flesh of the plantation dead when they were put on display. In another scene, labelled Typical Day in the Plantation, Cora has to act out a version of what she herself has gone through on the plantation in Georgia. But in this case, in the museum, it's a sanitized, cleaned up version with no killings or whippings. And she starts to see how institutions such as museums play a role within the institutions and the systems that permit and encourage enslavement, racism, and exploitation of Black people. That these places help construct and confirm the myths and stories that make such cruelty more possible to achieve. And there's one final section in this part of the book that I'd like to share with you. The stuffed coyotes on their stands did not lie, Cora supposed, and the anthills and the rocks told the truth of themselves. But the white exhibits contained as many inaccuracies and contradictions as Cora's 3 habitats. There had been no kidnapped boys swabbing the decks and earning pats on the head from the white kidnappers. The enterprising African boy, whose fine leather boots she wore, would have been chained below decks, swabbing his body in his own filth. Slave work was sometimes spinning thread, yes, most times it was not. No slave had ever keeled over dead at a spinning wheel or been butchered for a tangle. But nobody wanted to speak on the true disposition of the world, and no one wanted to hear it. Certainly not the white monsters on the other side of the exhibit at that very moment, pushing their greasy snouts against the window, sneering and hooting. Truth was a changing display in a shop window, manipulated by hands when you weren't looking, alluring and ever out of reach.